All right, let's get started. I want you to first get your attention here. Can you all see this egg here? I'm going to take this and I'm going to take it and smash it into my head, and I hate that when that happens. But now I hope I have your attention. We're going to be talking about broadcast law, and we'll pick up where we left off. The Titanic had just sunk. I think last time I said, will it sink? Well, unfortunately, the Titanic sinks. It's 1912. The radioactive 1910 has gone into effect, but it wasn't very powerful. 1912 comes along, the Titanic sinks, and people realize if they'd had better radio communication, many people could have been saved. So the radioactive 1912 does a couple things. One thing, it mandates that SOS is the emergency signal. The other is that radio operators have to have licenses. So that's the Radio Act of 1912. Now, in the next few years, more and more people want to broadcast on radio, and so there are so many people broadcasting on radio that nobody can hear everything. It's just you can't hear who you're trying to get through because there's so many overlapping stations, which is what happens when there's no regulation. So in 1927, the federal government put together a committee that was supposed to be temporary, and they called it the Federal Radio Committee, the FRC. So the FRC was formed in 1927. That was the 1927 Radio Act. That was to temporarily make sense out of the chaos. So in 1927, the FRC starts to do that. They start to give licenses, and the idea was that they would give everybody licenses, and then they wouldn't need the FRC anymore. Well, more and more people started to want licenses, and so they said this is going to be something that's going to be continuing and ongoing. So in 1934, they formed the Radio Act. The Radio Act of 1934 forms a new body. What used to be called the Federal Radio Commission. FRC is now called the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. So the FCC is created, and they did a couple of things. One of the first things that they did is what they learned is that the broadcast did not have First Amendment protection. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Next, the one other thing we want to talk about in this little segment is the Red Lion Broadcasting versus the FCC, a landmark case. When I was learning broadcast many years ago, I still remember learning about this case. Still very important today because it talks about some freedom of speech issue. And what happened is that the FCC ordered a radio station to give equal time to a political candidate. Basically, they slammed a political candidate. The FCC said, okay, you need to give that candidate some time to respond. And the radio station said, we don't have to do it. It's our First Amendment right to air whatever we want to. We don't want to do that. So what happens is the FCC makes a case out of it. They go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court makes the decision that the FCC, that broadcasting is not the same as print. And it does not necessarily have First Amendment protection. Very, very important. And at that time, the broadcasting is not considered the press. So a very important decision. Some things have changed since then. But when you wonder why broadcasting is not considered, why the rules aren't the same as with digital and some other things, online things, it all goes back to this case. This was the start of that case where they said, there's something different that's going on here. Okay, I will see you for the next